There is a specter that lives within each person's mind. This wraith is eternal, and it takes many forms. Some do not recognize the specter when it visits them. A happy few do not see the wraith until very late in their lives. But no one escapes meeting with a specter at least once, because of its innumerable roles in our mortal world. The wraith is called by many different names to tortured artists. This specter is often known as the muse. Ludwig von Berekech was born in 1734. His earliest years were spent in a small mountain village in the Swiss canton of Valais. Berekech saw the muse before he even recognized what the spirit was. Before the great composer even knew about music or the piano, the muse was already there in the corners of his mind. It haunted the earliest memories of his childhood dreams. The wraith's appearance remained consistent whenever young Ludwig saw him. It invariably appeared to Berekech as a man of medium age. The spirit's face was always harsh and severe. It manifested itself in his dreams abruptly. Suddenly it was there. Again and again, the spirit would fret and grasp idly at the hems of its own clothing while it leered intently in the boy's direction. Soon, the wraith also began to appear in Ludwig's waking mind, like a gargoyle made of pale flesh. The wraith stood persistently in the corners of Ludwig's vision as the child grew older. Ludwig's love of music was first sparked by a traveling inventor. The strange visitor arrived in Berekech's village on a peaceful summer day. The year was 1742, and young Ludwig was still merely a child of 8 years old. Calling the people of the town out to observe him, the inventor revealed a small barrel organ of his own design, powered by a hand-driven mechanism. The clockwork machine generated ornate music that flooded into the air. Berekech was fascinated not by the machine's complexity, but rather by the infinite creative possibilities that had been suddenly presented to him. The traveling inventor spoke with Ludwig after the show, and instilled in the boy a wanderlust that would take him far beyond the Swiss Alps. Anyone can create beautiful music, the inventor told Ludwig. Look at me. He laughed. I am a craftsman by trade, and not at all classically trained. The inventor crooked a thumb at his own chest and smiled proudly. Even someone like me can bring new music into the world. The young Berekech traveled to German Westphalia when he was 15 years old, following the Rhine out of Switzerland. He eventually found himself in the city of Bonn. Whether he realized it or not, it was the muse that urged him forward into that unknown world. Ludwig was young, and so his begging for food and shelter was met with enough sympathy to sustain him. He was eventually taken indoors by a composer who could afford to board him as a full-time servant. When the muse saw that Ludwig von Berekech might indeed thrive in Bonn, it compelled him forward with wild zeal. The young artist would finally have an opportunity to sit at a piano and work. He could pilfer time there whenever his master was out of the house. Now, you fool, the muse raged. Create with haste. The composer who took Ludwig into his home was a man by the name of Manfred Lang. Although he did provide for his servant in some ways, Lang was otherwise an extremely stern and unfriendly man. The old composer sometimes lashed out at Ludwig in ways that bordered on sadistic. One day, he was caught composing a short etude at his master's piano. Manfred Lang accused him of mashing away at the finely tuned keys with greasy, unskilled fingers. This was untrue, of course. To call Berekech unskilled was an outright lie. Master Lang's mind had fabricated the idea that Ludwig might damage the piano, and yet the old man simply could not be convinced otherwise. Ludwig was ordered to pack his things and leave forever. He was being thrown out of his master's home. Master Lang had his own struggles with the muse. The wraith prompts artists through the fear that it produces. It was this kind of anxiety which eventually stole Manfred's sanity. A twinge of arthritis in his left index finger drove Lang to fear the loss of his hands. He began to fixate on how his decades at the piano might become worthless if his hands began to fail. From there, Lang considered how his hearing might also suddenly leave him. Before long, the old master would abandon his craft completely. He would feel a great sense of relief when he realized that the muse had likewise abandoned him. On that first night after being cast out from Master Lang's home, the young Berekech was forced to sleep on the streets of Bonn. Ludwig did his best to huddle against the jutting cobblestones that paved the town's secluded alleyways. Even still, he could find no real shelter to protect himself. The howling wind and gouts of rain that lashed on from above that night persisted for hours. They threatened in earnest that Ludwig might easily be frozen to death. Ludwig felt hot fever creeping into his mind as he struggled to sleep. Soon, he began to dream vividly of the muse. The images in his mind took the form of a prophecy being revealed. Unlike Master Lang, these images did not frighten Barakech away from continuing to pursue his art. Instead, they made him deathly afraid of ever giving it up. Although he slept huddled against the stone wall of a public alleyway, Ludwig dreamed that he was standing comfortably inside of a richly decorated bedroom. It was a room that Barakech had never seen before, and yet the details of the place felt undeniably familiar. As Ludwig's eyes searched around, the tall and unsettling form of the muse leaned wordlessly into sight from the hallway. The wraith joined Ludwig in the unreal and yet familiar bedroom, and continued moving toward Barakech until the two were nearly nose to nose. With its pale blue eyes focused on Barakech, the muse reached spindly fingers into Ludwig's chest. The muse's bony digits slipped without resistance through the flesh of Ludwig's body, and he felt that the wraith was grasping for his heart. There was no pain beyond a strange tickle of numbness where the muse's fingertips had gone into him. As the muse withdrew its hand, it revealed a fistful of musical notes that it had retrieved from somewhere inside of Ludwig's body. The ethereal bits of music were now cupped in the spirit's emaciated palm. The muse held those bits of music aloft and allowed them to drift gently into the air for Barakech to see. The spirit then reached back inside Ludwig Barakech's chest with both of its hands. From somewhere inside of the dreaming artist, the muse continued retrieving musical notation. It pulled out crotchets, breves, quavers, timed signatures, rests, words of dynamic instruction, and more. The bits of music swooped and then stuck floating in the air nearby. The wraith continued pulling them out of Ludwig's chest. Soon, all the ephemeral swirls of ink that were marking out empty space in the air started congealing into a more tangible form. They were forming into the shape of a man. As more and more music flew across the room to add itself to the collection, Ludwig realized that he was looking into his own face. The music pulled out of Barakech by the muse was transforming into an eerie duplicate of the artist himself. The muse reached once more into Ludwig's heart, but discovered with a frown that there was no longer any more music to be pulled out. The numbness in Barakech's chest abruptly transformed into a fiery bolt of pain that flooded through his body and consumed him. The pale blue eyes of the muse flooded suddenly with a yellow light that poured out of them. It looked as though two burning lamplights were set within the muse's skull. With a scowl, the muse withdrew its hand, and Ludwig felt a deep exhaustion fall abruptly over him. It was a sensation that brought the composer to his knees. Crawling forward to steady himself against the nearby vanity table, Ludwig caught his own reflection in the large ovular mirror that was there. Barakech's vitality had been drained. In the dream, he was now a wizened and broken-looking old man. The pain in his chest had not subsided at all, and Ludwig felt sure that his heart was failing. The muse rushed suddenly toward Ludwig and moved to gather up the dying man's crumpled form. It forced Ludwig to his feet and directed him to look at the doppelganger made of music that still stood proud and young in the corner of the room, with blinding, yellow light streaming out of its eyes. The muse parted its worm-like lips to speak. Only one part of you can live forever. It was then that Ludwig awoke to find that the morning had arrived. He was still a young man, and he was lying in the street just as he had fallen asleep the night before. The mysterious and ornate room from his dream was now dissolved in the waking light. It was lost to him. The pain of having so much beautiful music inside his heart nearly drove Ludwig mad. His talent was immense, but Barakech was without reputation or even the mundane means by which his pursuit of music could continue. He took to begging and forgery, and devised clever ways of arranging his own invitations into wealthy homes and businesses. Ludwig quickly learned the mannerisms and accents of Bonn's most influential and well-connected people. This is how Barakech made himself familiar to those in affluent society who could fund his art properly. His playing and compositions were virtuosic, and over time his imitations of upper-class society became similarly advanced. He managed a bare and meager living in this way, pretending among the gentry as an effortless performer. It was while performing at a grand dinner hosted by Clemens August von Bayern that he met Jutta Voitzauer. It was Jutta who first approached Ludwig. She brought herself out from the crowd to congratulate Berekec after his performance was done. She engaged the composer with a shy smile and a clumsy introduction. Jutta charmed Ludwig immediately, in a moment of forwardness that surprised Berekec. She leaned to whisper in his ear. In a soft voice, she murmured, "I hope that my future husband will do nothing except play beautiful nocturnes, just as you have finished doing here." Although the Voitzauer family was slow to accept Berekec, Ludwig's passion for Jutta eventually won him their approval. His burgeoning reputation as a composer made the marriage acceptable to Bonn's elite social circles as well. The two were wed in the summer of 1760. The muse continued to appear to Ludwig during these years. It rubbed its palms together eagerly in Berekec's nightly dreams. It knew that Jutta was from wealth, and so it greedily anticipated her patronage of Ludwig's art. Hearing the muse count out the guilder and kreutzer in his wife's coffers made Ludwig feel ashamed. His love for Jutta was earnest, and yet the fact of her sizable wealth made him feel a guilt-ridden sort of excitement. The muse lusted eagerly after Jutta's financial patronage of Berekec's art. "Finally," shrieked the wraith inside Ludwig's head, "you can create every single day. No more petty concerns for your own sustenance." Although Jutta loved Ludwig and his music, she did not understand the depth of his passion. It was true that she often felt genuinely enraptured by his talent. This was the case for most anyone who heard Berekec play. Despite her appreciation for his art, it was undeniable that Jutta was not devoted to the pursuit of music as completely as Ludwig was. Jutta admired her husband, but she could not understand what drove him to work so tirelessly. Jutta had never been forced to see the fearful countenance of the muse for herself. Whenever Ludwig tried to describe how the wraith held his mind ransom, Jutta could only look at him with a bemused and ponderous expression on her face. It was in the first year of their marriage that Jutta purchased the magnificent piano upon which Ludwig would compose the greatest works of his life. It was a one-of-a-kind fortepiano that Jutta commissioned to meet her husband's ideal specifications. The keys spanned 5 octaves, and the sound was crisp and pure. There was never any hint of undue sharpness or flatness in any of the keys. Every single note of the instrument's tuning was absolutely perfect. Even the tritones in their permanent bitterness now sounded strangely sweet as well. The clavier was brought up from Italy, where it had been crafted from the finest wood and genuine ivory keys. It was a truly magnificent instrument, and its beauty would eventually seal Ludwig's fate. The real trouble started when Jutta got sick. She was suffering from a disease that made recovery unlikely, and her body wasted away until she was little more than a skeleton. This torment lasted 3 long years. During this time, Ludwig was horrified to learn that his wife began to see a strange new form of the muse. He had never shared with Jutta the details of how the wraith appeared to him, and yet now she frequently described that same specter as having come to visit her in her dreams. The more Jutta talked, the more there could be no doubt. The same frightful entity which had tormented Berekec since his childhood was now haunting his wife as well. "He looks to be starving. The man is impossibly thin for his stature," Jutta told Ludwig. "He keeps his dry and fraying hair combed neatly atop his head. His face is cleanly shaven, and his lips are grossly purple. They press together like 2 long worms that have found each other in the mud. Harsh yellow light shines from out of his eyes. There is so much yellow light, it often appears as though 2 summer suns live inside the man's skull. Pure yellow." Ludwig pressed Jutta to expand upon this detail. In one of his own dreams, he also remembered a yellow light that was produced by the muse's eyes. That was years ago, however, when he was still sleeping on the streets. The irises of the muse had since that time returned to a simple and pale blue color in Berekec's own dreams. "It must only be a fantasy," he ventured deceptively. Berekec did not wish to frighten his dying wife. "There is no such person. There is no man with eyes that shine yellow light, and yet the light pours out of him," she answered firmly. "It is a terrible visage that I have begun to see in my nightly dreams. I can make no mistake in describing it." Jutta then fell silent and did not speak again until the next morning. The muse had always been a veiled specter of death. This realization filled Ludwig with a grim sense of deep-rooted recognition. In a way, He had always suspected such a thing might be true. To create often filled Barakech with joy, and yet a darker urge to create always remained beneath that surface. When all joy is absent, why else would any great artist continue toiling? It can be attributed only to a primal sort of fear that we all feel, but do not often acknowledge. Why else would the muse demand so much from Ludwig? He realized at once that his work could only be intended to pay lasting tribute to death. Those pale blue eyes stared in the direction of young artists, but they also became monstrous as the inescapable truth of one's demise drew nearer. The eternal wraith no longer pretended innocently. To Ludwig, it was no longer the muse. The spectre now plainly wore the face of death instead, with two yellow eyes that rolled wildly in their hollows and produced a nauseating yellow light. The muse did not care for Yuta, but death visits everyone regardless of whether its spectre has made itself known previously. As many artists do, Ludwig had felt the presence of death his whole life. The urge to outrace it in the expression of himself had conducted his entire life and brought him here. Yes, he realized suddenly, it had brought him right here. Looking over to vanity table and oval mirror, Barakech recognized with a cold pang of terror that he had dreamed of this bedroom years before he ever met Yuta. This was the place where the muse had reached into his chest to pull out musical notes and summon a false image of Ludwig as a young man. This was the room in which Barakech had found himself suddenly transformed into an elderly wretch that was struggling not to die. The prophecy was coming true. Barakech felt a sharp pain near his heart as he imagined the muses sliding its hand between his ribs to pull out yet another fistful of music. Yuta died in 1777, and it was then that Barakech turned his mind away from the creation of music. For the first time in his life, he hated the idea of composing something new. Now that Yuta was gone, Ludwig felt sure that nothing beautiful could ever spring from his mind. He drank away 20 years of his own life and composed nothing while grieving fruitlessly for his lost love. Yuta's description of the man with yellow eyes had made him realize that death and the muse were two forms of the same eternal spectre. He hated this entity in all its forms now, because it had taken his wife away from him. After demanding music from Barakech for so long, it would not hesitate to continue stealing things away. The muse visited Ludwig's dreams constantly during those 2 decades. Its pale blue eyes now brimmed with that disgusting yellow light which had not been present before. Death was beginning to hide itself imperfectly. The wraith made less and less effort with each passing night to pretend that it was nothing more than the muse. It raged and threatened Barakech in his nightly dreams, always demanding that he produce more music. Ludwig resisted with a stubborn heaviness in his heart. He could no longer cooperate with the wraith. It had only ever held him captive. Worse still, it now dealt out pain and loss as though it owed Barakech nothing for his obedience. This dark period without creation would end miserably late. Inspiration finally reclaimed Ludwig's mind, but it arrived as the 11th hour of his life was nearly done. Barakech realized that he could write something that would immortalize Yuta forever. The strains of that perfect melody were finally beginning to form inside his head. He hated the muse, but he could now work in service of Yuta's memory instead. She was the only love of his mortal life, and the only human soul to which Ludwig had ever felt himself gladly devoted. To give up music without honoring Yuta would be a betrayal of what she meant to him. He returned to sit at the piano that his wife had commissioned for him, largely untouched for years. The instrument was layered with dust, but still perfect in its sound. On a sheet of paper, Ludwig began to scratch out the opening notes of a new symphony. Death was behind him before Barakech even sensed it. Of course, he should have known that it would arrive with that terrible punctuality that death so loves to practice. Eventually, Ludwig recognized that the wraith was once again standing there with him. It waited patiently to be acknowledged, but eventually placed its hand on his shoulder to rouse Barakech from his willful focus on smaller matters. Ludwig recognized deaths from his own memories of the muse. Its eyes were now just as Yuta had described them. The silhouette of a man materialized around those glowing, yellow eyes. For the first time, the spirit was no longer an intangible form. It previously haunted the dark corridors of Ludwig's mind, but no longer was it confined there as a mere apparition. Barakech now truly saw the wraith from his dreams standing before him. In the moments before his life was ended, Ludwig pleaded with death. He spoke of mortal love and of the artist's divine purpose. Barakech described how these two infinite passions were merged inside of his heart. Together, they produced a rare and extraordinary form of grief. Barakech expressed the full sum of this grief now, detailing his pain with a desperate flood of sentimental words. In the end, Ludwig must have presented a truly compelling appeal to be spared. Death's hand was briefly stayed, even though it should have reached forward without hesitation to confiscate Barakech's last breath. It didn't. There was a particular reason for this gesture of false mercy. The spirit it had invested in Ludwig for decades while disguised as the muse. And even eternal specters have their moments of vanity. You will use your borrowed time for an assigned purpose, Death told the composer. You will write a grand concerto to honor me. You must glorify mortality itself. Barakech shifted in fear without saying anything. He needed time to write for Yuta. And yet if he did not agree, then there could be no time to write for her at all. I will write Death's concerto, Barakech replied in a wavering voice. He prayed that Death would not detect the hollowness of that promise. A wide and gross smile crept across Death's face as the wraith stepped backwards toward the doorway. There are at most 13 days that I may lend you, the spirit growled. Beyond that, these matters are already resolved. My influence cannot alter them further. Ludwig feared death as any of us do, but he was driven by an emotion even greater than that fear. Yuta had given him the gift of time to practice his art, and he owed her an homage that matched the beauty of what that meant to him. To leave her symphony unfinished would be to fail her again. Ludwig couldn't let himself be helpless in losing Yuta for a second time. For that reason, he worked without rest on the music that would immortalize her, rather than honor death. He could only think of his late wife. Barakech wrote with feverish inspiration, and barely slept at all during those 13 days. He knew that death would try to visit him in his dreams. It would berate him for his negligence in honoring their deal. When he did lapse into unconsciousness, his mind was so consumed by music for Yuta that he dreamed vividly of her and saw nothing else. He dreamed that Yuta was still alive, or instead that they were both already together in the afterlife. He finished the opening sonata of Yuta's symphony before the end of his third borrowed day. A gentle, drifting adagio would function as the symphony's second movement. Ludwig completed this part on the morning of his fifth day. It was the scherzo that tortured his heart the most fiercely, because he imagined dancing it with Yuta. This part challenged Barakech, and it took until the 9th day before he was satisfied by its beauty. Without realizing how much time had passed, Barakech nearly finished the final rondo of his symphony when the sun began to set on his 13th borrowed day. A thin sneer of disdain crossed Death's mask-like face as Ludwig looked up from his piano to see the spirit standing behind him. The wraith spoke aloud. The Lady Voitzauer waits for you, Death announced, but you have twice refused to join her. Now there is no longer a question. Although you should retire to meet your wife, you cannot. Ludwig von Barakech's body was found with an expression of pure anguish on his face. The drying trails of 2 twin teardrops still marked their paths across his face. One had rolled down each of his cheeks from his still open eyes. Yuta's symphony was nearly finished, but tragically it remained without its final coda. There was no cadence, no resolution. It is said that an additional piece of sheet music was also discovered in the bedroom where the great composer died. It was found crumpled in the late Barakech's clenched fist. Ludwig had hastened in his last moments to write something that he could show Death. He had hoped in vain that he might bargain for a little more time. Barakech managed to specify the key and time signature before the wraith took him. He indicated that Death's symphony should begin in either G minor or B flat major, and that it should proceed in 3/4 time. Beyond that, it seemed that Barakech had the opportunity only to add a single word of dynamic instruction to the page. The sheet said "Marendo," fading away. The Barakech fortepiano was truly a masterwork of musical construction. It held its tuning with almost impossible precision, and so the elegance of its sound never faded. Even as the decades turned to centuries, the piano rang out harmonies that were pure and perfect. Such an object is never discarded. It can only change hands until some physical calamity finally destroys it. Hunted things tend to gravitate and to find each other as time passes. Years become decades and then centuries. And in that interlude, Barakech's piano found its way to the Gracie Manor. The spirit of Ludwig von Barakech lingers here too. The composer's ghost remains bound to the instrument that consumed the final days of his life. Ludwig will stay until Death's concerto is finished. Death takes what it is owed, and it is invariably owed everything that we have. Though an artist might briefly satisfy the muse, nothing can ever lessen the magnitude of that final debt. The music plays on whether we listen or not.